Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Farm Management During Uncertain Times. My name is Tori Marshall, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session on considerations for drought-stressed corn and soybeans. So with us today, our panel, we have Les Humple, who is a Farm Management Area Specialist for UT Extension. We also have David Bilderback, who is another Farm Management Area Specialist. Les is in Middle Tennessee, and David is in East Tennessee. We also have joining us Dr. Katie Mason. She is an assistant professor and beef extension specialist in nutrition management. So for our topic today, before we get started, I just kind of want to lead us into this with one quick figure. And what we see here is this is the drought monitor for the United States as of July 28th of 2022. And as we can see here, we see parts of Tennessee that are in that abnormally dry to all the way to severe drought out in the western region and some in Middle Tennessee. So there are parts in Tennessee that really aren't suffering from that lack of critical rain right now, but there are other parts and producers that are currently asking the questions of, what do I do if I have a crop that is drought stressed and may not produce those adequate yields that I want to see for this year? How do we go about this? And that's kind of where we wanted to go with this topic is today is considerations not only for those row crop producers, but also for cattle producers as well. If they're considering, we are having some concerns about hay availability as well as hay quality this year. So we want to look at this from both perspectives, the cattle producers or livestock producers, as well as the row crop producers. But I know we've got a lot of questions to get into for this session, but I guess one of the first things I want to ask, and I'll direct this initial question to Les, is what is one of the top things that a row crop producer should consider before just going in and chopping or cutting a drought stress crop?
Yeah, thank you, Tori. One of the first things I would look at is, what level of loss do you have? And one of the best ways to do that is contact your insurance carrier to have an adjuster come out, take a walk through the field, estimate the loss percentage, and if there's any payments that'll be triggered. Typically, what they'll do is they'll have you, before it's harvested, you want to leave a few rows throughout the field, or you can have maybe an estimate a little bit later on. But again, working with that insurance adjuster and to see if you are able to harvest it for silage to receive your payment or your indemnity. Another thing I would do, I would just reach out to your farm service agency just to make sure that this is you're able to do this and everything is recorded in their offices, so it does count toward your basis later on. But first thing, yeah, definitely reach out to your crop insurance agents to see if your crop qualifies for a disaster or a payment.
So I guess one of the things that we've got to make sure before we just, jump the gun and go with this action is talk to our crop insurance agents and FSA to make sure that this is a viable option for us, right, Les?
Right. Kind of make that determination. Is it worth more to harvest or insurance payment? And then if you're able to do that, moving on to, as a silage for whether your own herd or for a neighbor.
Absolutely. So that's kind of one of the top considerations and things that we have to make sure the first thing we do as a row crop producer. But now I kind of want to shift gears to the livestock producers. And when we think about this, that they also have to make, if they're going to be feeding these drought stress crops, they have to think about the quality of what they're feeding and what their cattle are going to need in these circumstances, especially through the winter time. And so I want to ask Katie, this question is, with this feed that we're doing, this drought stress crop, is this going to be quality feed? What are the nutrition requirements that cattle need? Are we able to be picky right now? So can you kind of talk about that as far as what cattle producers need to consider, the nutritional requirements for their herds?
Sure. Thanks, Tori. That's a really important consideration, thinking ahead to the winter feeding months. And so maybe we're not able to be as picky right now, given the feed resources that we have, but we can be strategic in the way that we use those resources. So the first thing that is important to know is that these crops can potentially be high quality, but just like grass hay, it really depends on when they're cut. And so that's going to be individual to the producer. And the most important thing that we can take away from that is making sure that we test whatever crop this is after we put it up for hay or silage, to make sure that it has either the appropriate nutritive value, or at least that we know the nutritive value of that feed. And then we can balance a ration based off of that. So it is difficult for us to say, to cut at a certain moisture or a certain stage, and this will be the quality. The only way we can know the quality is to test that hay after it's been made. So once we've produced this crop, this stored feed, we want to know the quality of that feed, and we also want to think about the nutrient needs of our cattle. So our cattle will have different needs based on their stage of production. If we have a lower quality feed, we're going to utilize that feed for our cows that are dry cows. And if we have a higher quality feed, we want to use that for our pregnant cows or our lactating cows, those that have a calf on their side. And so it's also important to remember that full bellies don't always mean full of nutrients. So if these forages or feeds do need some type of supplement based on that analysis, we want to make sure that we're supplementing with either energy or protein that is an appropriate level for those animals. And so you would work with one of the farm managed specialists to determine what feedstuffs are most economical in your area, and make sure you provide that supplement to meet the needs of cattle on top of what may be in this silage or hay that's being produced. Finally, the last consideration is handling considerations, and I believe that we might touch on that later, but just making sure that you have a way to handle silage and maybe, if you have to chop it after it's time to feed, or something to mix this feed with, making sure that you have the capability to do that is going to be important before you purchase some of these feedstuffs.
Katie, I think you just provided a lot of great information for cattle producers, livestock producers to consider their quality. We've got to make sure that if this is an option that we're thinking about, we have to make sure that what we're providing our cattle through that wintertime feeding, that they have what they need to get through it and continue to be the quality herd that we want to be for our farm. Absolutely.
Dr. Mason, I've got a quick question. Are there any concerns with nitrates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking a little bit more on the management side or the production side of the crop itself, nitrates are certainly a concern this year with drought conditions. And so when we think about harvesting that crop, we can go and do a field test and see if nitrates are high in that crop at the time that it's harvested. And then certainly we can make some considerations for that when we cut. So cutting a corn crop a little bit higher off the ground can potentially reduce that nitrate load. But once we put that crop up as a feedstuff, we want to test even after it's been ensiled or it's been put up, just to make sure that the nitrate levels are either safe or that we dilute that feed with something else if they are higher than our recommended level.
Thanks, David, for bringing that up. That was a great thought that we needed to also ask about as well. You were talking about this being the quality, the ability to cut this corn, drought stress corn or soybean crop, the ability to do that. And that's kind of where I want to gear our next question to, is this a viable option for producers that don't normally partake in this? And I want to lean this towards David. Is this a viable option? And if it is, how do producers go about, row crop producers, pricing this corn or drought stress bean crop? How do we do that right now?
Yeah, and it's very dependent.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give the economist answer. It depends. So it depends on the location that you're at and the needs in your surrounding community, is the way I would put it. If you have some dairies or backgrounders in your area that have the ability to feed corn silage, there's going to be more of ability to sell some of these stress crops, or if you can utilize them yourself. But really looking, the first thing I always tell people when trying to price something that we're not used to pricing, we're not used to pricing corn for silage in a lot of areas of Tennessee. And, the typical starting point, if we say corn silage is worth $50 to $60 a ton on a typical year, that's for a high quality, great corn silage. And that's not what we're going to get. That's not the product we're going to get from this stressed corn with the lack of ear and within the silage. So you sort of got to start backing off of that price. And I always say, well, what should the exact price be? Well, again, it really depends on, who around you. Do you have neighbors that have the capacity to handle and feed this? Because you can spend a lot of money real quick getting the capacity to feed some of these feeds. And they're still going to have to be supplemented, as Dr. Mason was mentioning earlier, with another commodity. So really what I would have anybody do, if you're really being confronted with this situation, contact one of your area specialists. My contact information, I think, will be at the end of this video. You're welcome to call me. I can help walk through the situation depending on your area and the ability. Because from the standpoint of putting corn silage on the ground, we can do that. If we have a flat area, you don't have to have a bunker. You have to feed it a little quicker. But you still probably need a mixer wagon, the ability to feed a TMR or a total mixed ration, as we talk about. From the bean standpoint, you're probably looking at putting it up as baleage or high moisture hay. And when you look at that, it really depends. You're at a lower price point than corn silage. A typical haylage for a great haylage crop, you're looking $40 to $50 a ton typically, but you're going to be back off of that some, depending on what stage that this bean haylage is produced and the quality. Again, I think Dr. Mason hit on the point. We have to test to get the nutrient value of these feedstuffs, because they're not going to be the typical values that we see in a book or what we would expect it to be. And again, it's handling that baleage and having the equipment. If you've got some neighbors in the community that can really utilize it, if you've got a dairy or somebody that's short on feed, go speak with it, work a deal, that's mutually beneficial for both parties. Typically, that seems to be the best way to approach these situations.
David, I want to ask you real quick. You were talking about the capability to do this. Is this possible to just do this through the bean haylage? Is it possible just to do that through a typical round baler, or do we need to be concerned when we're thinking about that?
It is. There's people that use typical for high moisture hay, but you can cause some damage to those typical balers as well. And that could be an expensive fix, depending on what happens, because you're dealing with a lot more weight and stuff there. But depending on the baler you have, and then are there wrappers available to get within the community to come in and wrap and get it up. It's also a timing situation, depending on where you're at and how severe the drought. The corn silage, you may be past the point where it's an option to chop it. So I know we have a couple of Koster moisture testers out in Middle and West Tennessee with small choppers. If you're considering it, give give one of us a call and we'll try to get you connected where we could get that out to you and you could test and see what the moisture levels are within that corn.
So we know that there is a lot more questions that we could try to answer in this video. We could make this an hour-long video if we really wanted to on this one topic, but I do want to ask each of you one more time, what's the takeaway message that each of you want producers, whether they're row crop, livestock producers, what's the takeaway message that you want them to remember after watching this video? Les, I'll start with you.
Well, for one, there's a cost to it. There's a cost to harvesting, especially on the silage side of it. But more importantly, get with your crop insurance carrier and agent, determine that what level of loss there is when they file the insurance and the payment capacity of that, and also making sure that you are able to harvest that for it won't affect any of the indemnity payments that you do have.
Great point there. Dr. Mason?
Yeah, I think the really important take home here from a livestock feeding perspective is knowing what you're feeding. So from a nitrate standpoint, knowing what the nitrate level is so you can determine if you need to dilute that feed stuff. And that nitrate test is a separate test from the forage analysis itself. And so, of course, also having that forage analysis so that you know the energy and protein values of that feed. And you can use it most efficiently, and you can supplement if needed to make sure that you get the proper nutrition to your animals.
Then finally, to wrap us up, David, what's your final thoughts?
Well, if you're really struggling with one of these decisions, especially to chop and how to price or any of that stuff, it's a very difficult. It's a very complex situation, and it really depends on location and resources in the area. But if you ever need to give us a call, we'll help walk you through. Tori's out in West Tennessee. I can answer as well or less, and we can sort of work through and try to figure out a good situation for everybody involved. But really hope the rain kicks in and we end up getting some better crops than what are expected at this point, and really thinking about y'all on the west side of the river of the state especially.
First and foremost, thank you to all of our panelists today for joining on this. We know that these are hard topics to try to cover right now, and these are hard questions to try to answer during these times, but thank you to our panelists for stepping up and trying to help us navigate these times. There are other sessions as well for those watching. We have marketing strategies for crops during drought, culling strategies during drought. Please check out those videos as well. You may see some familiar faces on those also. Just continue to be on the lookout as we continue to add videos to this library for this series of farm management during uncertain times. But thank you again for everyone joining us.